Hello again. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Andrew Horgan and I'm the Chief Development Officer here at Pioneer. We're delighted to have a fantastic panel with us today to share some insights on the important role of immigration and what the impact it can have on catalyzing economic growth. Jim Stergios, Pioneer's Executive Director, will lead our conversation. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time for some Q&A. So please utilize the Q&A function in the Zoom application for any questions you may have for today's panelists. Finally, be sure to stick around until the end as I will be back to share an overview of some upcoming events here at Pioneer. Jim, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is a great lunchtime conversation to have. I'm really pleased to have Mark Williams with us from Boston University and Josh Bedi from University of Wisconsin. Great to have you guys. The topic of the conversation, as Andrew was saying, is, as we call it in the title, Visas to Ventures, Unlocking Immigrant Economic and Entrepreneurial Potential. It's a big part of what Pioneer does in the economic opportunity space, together with housing and making sure the state is competitive with other states for business, for growth, for capital, for talent. Our conversation is going to be talking about immigrant entrepreneurship, but it's also going to be talking about broader issues around the economy. We want to also take into consideration some recent research from Mark Williams on the impact of the first 100 days of the new administration, what it means for us, specifically on immigration. Mark is a master lecturer in finance at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. He has deep experience as a senior trading floor executive in the Federal Reserve as a Federal Reserve examiner. He's a past president of the Boston Economics Club. He is a frequent commentator on risk management, economic policy. He teaches courses on fintech, capital markets, and global risk. Josh Bedi is Pioneer's senior fellow on immigrant entrepreneurship. He's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. His academic work focuses on applied microeconomics, entrepreneurship, and immigration. Pleased to have both of you. Just a note to everyone on the webinar today that their recent reports are in the chat, I believe, to be shared with you, or they will soon be shared with you. The papers in particular, they're going to be drawing from something called Missing the Boat, Outdated Immigration Policies and Threats of International Competition, published by Pioneer. It examines how the complexity of the U.S. immigration system has delayed the creation of over 150,000 businesses and cost us 500,000 jobs as a country over the past, between 2013 and 2021. He argues for a modernization of the visa system because we are foreclosing our access to a lot of talent, whereas other countries are doing something very different, seeking to attract that talent. Mark Williams has weighed in recently in the past few months with two reports. I'm going to focus on just one of them here, which is the economic impact of Trump policies on Massachusetts. It is a 99-slide deck. It covers a lot of territory, including trade tariffs, the NIH funding cuts, and also immigration enforcement. The study warns of cascading risks across the state's key industries and forecasts some real damage to Massachusetts. So let's just jump right into it. And Josh, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Just talking, let's set the table. I have a few questions for you guys to set the table. First one is, paint us a picture of the contributions of immigrants specifically to the economy nationally, and then Massachusetts. And Mark, I'm going to come right to you and ask the same question.
Yeah, sure. So in general, immigrants make us more productive. My research focuses specifically on how they make us more productive as entrepreneurs. And along that vein, they're 80% more likely than natives to become entrepreneurs, to own their own business. In Massachusetts specifically, they own half of Fortune 500 companies, or they started half of Fortune 500 companies, either a first or second generation immigrant did, which means they're responsible for billions of dollars in revenue. They're responsible for hundreds of thousands of jobs, and that's only in Massachusetts. And those are only their direct contributions as entrepreneurs. They also make us more productive by using their comparative advantages. They're better at some things than natives are. Natives are better at other things than they are. And so they amplify Americans' existing capabilities as well.
Mark, can you build on that? And I'd be really interested in hearing also about sort of uh, is there evidence that we can bring to the conversation on the contributions of legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants as separate?
Sure. In general, across the U.S., immigrants themselves represent an increasing part of our U.S. population. Just in the last decade, it's increased to almost 15% of the U.S. population. Of that population of roughly 48 million immigrants and growing, there's roughly 12 million undocumented immigrants. It's hard to know, Jim, exactly how many. There's not a survey out there where people can verify that. But the 12 million itself, both groups combined provide not only population growth, which we need within our U.S. population, but they also provide growth within our labor supply, and also in regard to meeting certain jobs specifically within our economy. And these are actually barbell jobs. In general, they're jobs such as transportation, manufacturing, warehousing, where on the other extreme, as we see in Massachusetts, roughly 29% of the immigrant population represent an important role, and that is in STEM-related jobs. And that helps drive our knowledge-based economy. So it's quite diverse. It's really hard to go across the U.S. and say that there's a uniform job for immigrants. But in general, these are the themes that Josh, through his reports and some of the research I've done, have come and uncovered.
That's great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate that. I guess I'd want to dig in a little further on something that Josh said as well. You said that they have a greater propensity, a greater sort of risk profile when it comes to entrepreneurship. They are risk takers. Can you talk to us a little bit about that aspect of what you found in the research?
Yeah, absolutely. So one question to ask is, why are immigrants more likely to start a business than natives? Because it's not just true in the US, it's actually almost a stylized fact. It's true in almost every single country in the world. And it's also true for immigrants of all different education levels. This isn't just a highly educated immigrant phenomenon. Also, there are immigrants with very low levels of education who are more likely to start businesses like barbershops or nail salons or things like this. And a big theory as to why that is, as you pointed out, Jim, is that entrepreneurship is a risky endeavor. It takes, it's not for the meek-hearted. Nothing is guaranteed when you start a business. And the same is true when you become an immigrant. When you become an immigrant, you drop everything in your life and you go to a new place that you don't necessarily know. It's also very risky. So the type of person that tends to take on that risk, of immigration to better their own life, is also the type of person who's likely to start a business. And so that's kind of the mechanism as to why immigrants are more entrepreneurial than natives.
Mark, you were talking just a second ago about sort of the barbell, right? And we're talking about knowledge economy driven jobs, and we're talking about on the other end things that are probably I guess what some people would consider less skilled jobs. And can you paint a picture for us here in Massachusetts of sort of industry by industry where there's a greater prevalence, a greater presence of immigrants?
Sure. In Massachusetts in particular, we have in the construction industry a large percentage of immigrants, and that's immigrants that are here legally or are actually undocumented. So that's a very important labor pool for that industry. And of course, that's one of the growth engines in Massachusetts construction, as well as in manufacturing. Both groups, documented and undocumented, are a large percentage of that, as well as in transportation. The warehousing, extremely important. Anything that's sort of physically needed to be moved, either manufactured, moved, delivered, or actually on the other end, in the food services industry, tend to be dominated by immigrants in particular.
Mark, just to follow up,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I thought Josh raised a very good point, and that is the fact that immigrants come, they have to take risk, and as a result, being a larger risk taker, you're more likely to actually be an entrepreneur. In my research, I've also found there's other attributes as well. So as immigrants come come here, they're also coming many times from resource-constrained areas. So as a result, being resource-constrained, they're actually more creative. And also, we've found that having this sort of cross-country or cross-cultural experience also allows them to look with a different lens when they're in the U.S. and they see opportunities that maybe Jim, you or Josh or myself may not even recognize. So I think it's really a complicated influence of many things that really create this entrepreneurial spirit and the high percentages that Josh spoke about earlier.
Yeah. Just one final thing that we're going to move to the research papers that you guys wrote. And I guess, when you look at Massachusetts, again, just focusing on Massachusetts for a second, we have had this perennial issue, as many states have, which is you have a whole bunch of job openings and you have job seekers on the other side, and often they don't match up, right? Can you folks share any insights on what that picture looks like in Massachusetts and how it relates to immigrants in Massachusetts?
Sure. Well, let me jump in on this, and then Josh, go ahead and complete. When we think about Massachusetts in particular, we still have 2 times more jobs out there than takers. And so what that means is we have a labor shortage in Massachusetts. And over the last decade, the labor supply growth itself has come from immigrants. So if we were to take the immigrant population away, the growth aspect, we would not have labor supply growth, and that would be actually concerning within our labor markets. So what we've found through research is that labor markets are driven by immigration and the flow of immigration. And they also solve and take care of jobs that not only others don't want, but also they fill jobs that are open. And of course, as you know, Jim, longer term for our economic growth in Massachusetts, we have to have a growing population, a growing workforce to meet the needs of a growing economy.
Josh, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so Mark, he brought up some really good points, right? I think one of those really good points was that immigrants take the jobs that natives don't want. And we actually have quantitative research that shows that. And again, it's not just in the US, it's in multiple countries. I'm familiar with research in the US and in Denmark that shows when immigrants come to these countries, come to these host countries, they don't take jobs, right? There's this spurious notion that immigrants take jobs. Instead, what happens is occupational upgrading, what we call in the academic literature, among natives. So when immigrants come in, natives instead, they move up the occupational ladder. They take less manually intensive jobs and more communication intensive jobs, which makes sense because natives are better at the language than immigrants. I have a couple of co-authors who are immigrants and they speak great English, but I have a few years on them, right? And so when we write together, I focus on the theory, I focus on the actual writing aspect, and they focus on the math. And again, I can do math, right? But we use our comparative advantages to amplify each other. And you can think of it outside of an academic setting. Whenever you go to a restaurant, there's the back of the house, the people that cook, and there's the front of the house, your customer-facing jobs. Your native speakers, your US born, are more likely to be your hostess, your server. They're more likely to be front of the house. And your immigrants are more likely to be in the back of the house. It's more manually intensive. It's less communication intensive. And so because of what Mark said, because immigrants take jobs that natives don't want, we see that when they come, they actually don't take jobs. They create more jobs, even if they're not entrepreneurs themselves, which implies that when we remove them, we also remove some jobs.
Yeah. Just one final thing before we move to talking about your paper, Missing the Boat, Josh. To set the table, when we look at Massachusetts, we look at legal immigrants versus undocumented. We're looking at what, Mark? What's the pie? What is the category and what are the numbers that we don't know precisely, but what do you think they are, generally speaking?
Sure. Legal immigrants, about 1 million, and undocumented, about 400,000. So the total population, 1.4 million.
Helpful. That's super helpful. Thank you, guys. Appreciate that opening. And Josh, I'm going to turn to you for a sec here, which is I'd love to have you. Let's not talk about the last 100 days for now. Let's talk about what we knew back in November, December about our immigration system and what you found in writing Missing the Boat.
Sure. We can actually, we don't have to separate those two issues because our immigration system itself has not really changed
Yep.
since before Trump became president. In fact, it hasn't changed substantively since 1986, since Ronald Reagan. And even then, Ronald Reagan didn't fundamentally change the visa system. He simply changed enforcement, and he actually gave a lot of unauthorized immigrants amnesty. The last real change to our immigration visa system, where we fundamentally altered the number of immigrants we allow into the country at the congressional level, was in the 60s. It was in 1965. And so what I mainly find from my research is that our immigration system is incredibly outdated. It's based on labor market conditions that are no longer relevant, and it's based on almost racist ideology. It was designed to try to keep up the flow of immigrants from certain countries, and our our current immigration is no longer necessarily based on racist ideology, right? But in the 60s, right, we had a long way to go, and some of the darker parts of our past showed up in our immigration law. So it's outdated. It doesn't reflect current labor market conditions. And yeah, we haven't changed it in 50 years now.
Well, can you give a sense as to sort of the flow into the country? What kind of visas are they coming in on? Give us sort of a picture of what that system looks like.
Absolutely. So we have a few broad categories of visas. You have family reunification visas, you have work visas, and then you have humanitarian visas as well, things like refugee programs, asylum programs. And the U.S. visa system is actually a lot more complicated than that. Within those three or four broad categories, you have over 180 very specific different types of visas that are tailored to specific situations. In the U.S., if we compare our immigration system to the immigration system of other countries, we actually favor family reunification a little bit more than other countries. Other countries, uh, Canada, European countries, they focus on labor market immigrants. They also focus on immigrants with very high levels of education. I actually was an immigrant for 3 years to Denmark. I lived in Denmark for 3 years, and they focus on highly educated immigrants so much that I had a special tax rate that I paid in Denmark that was about 10 percentage points lower than what a Danish person pays. And they gave me that. I had access to that for 5 years. I was only there for three. And so that's the big fundamental difference between that's the like specific fundamental difference between our visa system and other countries. Ours is more complicated, which leaves more room for manipulation, both by immigration authorities and by immigrants themselves. We've heard in the news some high profile instances of immigration authorities kind of using our complex visa rules and our complex border situation to their advantage in nefarious ways. So it's more complicated, and it also favors, for historical reasons, it favors family reunification immigrants over labor market immigrants, especially highly skilled labor market immigrants. We actually only allow about 65,000 H-1B visas per year, which are dedicated to your STEM immigrant workers.
Right. Just give us a sense of who is getting in, who's not getting in, what's sort of how hard is it to get through to get to a green card? Give us some of some overview stats here, if you could, Josh.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's almost impossible for most immigrants to quote unquote get in line. When we talk about getting in line, over 99% of immigrants are not eligible to immigrate to the US outright. Either they don't meet criteria. For example, we have country quotas. So only a certain portion of immigrants can come from any given country. So if you're from a very highly populated country like India or China, your wait time could be your whole life, if not longer. And so it's incredibly difficult for the typical immigrant. When we look at H-1B visas in general, 75% of those applications get rejected, and many, many more people would apply for an H-1 visa if we upped the cap. It's a lottery-based system, and so we allocate it, and we allocate it almost instantly. Right. We allocate it at the very beginning of the year, and so there are tons more companies that would hire an immigrant that would pay taxes in order to hire an immigrant who just aren't legally allowed.
So what does it mean for entrepreneurs, and how are other countries, behaving in this marketplace for talent compared to the United States? What is the picture, the competitive picture look like?
Well, they've taken to actively poaching our immigrants. Canada in particular. Canada is a big competitor with the US for immigration. We're right next to each other. English is a dominant language. So the type of immigrant who could feasibly immigrate to the US can also feasibly immigrate to Canada. Canada has recognized that. They've also, Canadian officials have also recognized that the US immigration system is a bit like a labyrinth, and they've plastered billboards in Silicon Valley that say H-1B problems come to Canada. I've also seen Facebook posts where they've said, they're actively poaching immigrants. And we have, again, quantitative evidence. We have really good research that shows that immigrants in the US, after these Canadian programs, they've been 69% more likely to relocate their business into Canada or to start a business in Canada rather than the US. And between, I think, 2017 and 2021, about the same time period you cited from my study, Canada poached 45,000 Indian college grads, just Indian college grads. And so these are only the immigrants that Canada is actively trying to poach. There are other immigrants who are making decisions and deciding based on continuously updated information, where do I want to go? I want to leave whatever country I'm in for whatever reason. Most of them want to leave because the policies in their country of origin aren't conducive to entrepreneurship. They don't encourage entrepreneurial talent. So they want to go to a place that does. And they have to make that decision. And they're becoming more and more likely to pick other places like Canada over the US, which means we're losing talent.
Let's be sure later on in the conversation we start talking about next steps. We have a good long back and forth on what we can do to fix that visa system to attract the talent, retain talent, that sort of thing. But just for both you and Mark, if I could, and then I'm going to switch into Mark's paper and kind of turning to the last 100 days. Do we have a sense across the country and in Massachusetts as to, number one, the number of foreign students studying here? And two, what is the general breakdown, sort of STEM versus other studies? Do we have any knowledge on that?
Oh, we do, Jim. Yeah, that's a great question as well. And we have 1.1 million students that come to the US to study, and this is undergrad and graduate students. This makes us the #1 importer of foreign students, when I would argue foreign talent. And for Massachusetts in particular, it's extremely important because that helps feed our knowledge-based economy. And when innovation and innovation-driven type entrepreneurial ventures can be started, then that's really a good input. So within Massachusetts, of that 1.1 million that come to the US, we are the recipient of roughly 82,000 students per year. Last year was the highest year so far, which indicates a big swing up since COVID. And also it shows that not only does talent, they can go anywhere globally, but they've chosen Massachusetts because of our great universities and the opportunities post-graduation.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn to you for a little bit here on your report, the economic impact of Trump policies on Massachusetts. Again, it's a great work. It's just tremendous digging on several issues. I want to focus on the immigration-related pieces of that, Mark, if we could, and maybe just start by asking if you could just let's set the table and let's just say, what have the policies been over the past 100 years? What are they specifically in the sense of which ones are substantially different, substantively different? Sorry.
Sure. I thought Josh did a nice job of really speaking about sort of some of the weaknesses since the 1960s and how immigration policy was set up. Post 1960s, what we've seen is different waves of immigrants that have come. In the 1960s, we had lots of European immigrants, in particular, a lot of Italians. The Italians were the #1 group in 1960. And then by the 1980s, we move where China it becomes a large group, but the #1 is Mexico, and then into the 1990s, and now where we are in 2024. If we look at Massachusetts in particular, our largest immigration population has been Chinese, followed by Dominican Republic and India. And so these groups themselves are very important to our knowledge-based economy.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. I guess if I could, let's dig into, is there any, and this is something I want to get into later on, we get into next steps. We've heard about obviously deportations, legal action, all kinds of different moves to restrict immigration and also to increase deportations. The numbers on that are much debated. Is there any discussion underway right now about expanding legal immigration? And where is that happening right now?
Sure. Well, if you think about the Trump administration, what it did day one, and some of its early decisions as soon as Donald Trump became president for the second term, was to restrict the amount of inflow of immigrants. So put more restrictions at the border, increase the amount of ICE deportations in the interior of the United States, redefine who was a legal immigrant from a perspective of being able to stay here on a temporary basis. And then also create an environment in which maybe immigrants aren't as welcome. And this comes into play very strongly in Massachusetts as we set a negative tone for not only foreign students, immigrants that potentially would have come here, who Josh had mentioned possibly could be going to places like Canada and other countries. So we actually lose in Massachusetts a competitive edge when we think that our population is 20% immigrant, our work population is roughly 23% immigrant, and our entrepreneurs are roughly 25% immigrant. So this is our Achilles heel in a sense. We're used to importing top talent, and now all of a sudden that flow of talent is potentially being restricted and reduced.
Those are great numbers because they just prove the point on immigrants, on risk taking, their risk profile, and also the fact that they are, if you will, overemployed compared to their population. Right? That's interesting stuff, Mark. Let me talk to you a little bit about. Let's have a discussion around some of the analyses in your report, and I'd love to hear specifically where you see the impacts of, let's say, the first 100 days of the administration, and maybe focus on things like money spent in the economy or tax revenues, sort of hard numbers that we could kind of dig into and see what the impacts have been.
Sure. Well, projecting out, looking at, say, 2026, where we will see the biggest hit, in Massachusetts in particular, the tax base itself is supported by the immigrant community. And when we look at Donald Trump policies in particular, the policies include not only deporting undocumented immigrants, which I mentioned is roughly 400,000. That's the estimate. If that group gets deported over a certain percentage over, again, we have to just project where we think that's going to be, Jim. That reduces not only our tax rate, but also those positions that would be filled in regard to our labor market. So those are the two big economic hits. In my analysis, just looking at 2026, the loss in taxes could be up to, for example, $400 million for the state of Massachusetts. So that's significant. In a sense, this is a population that is documented and undocumented that actually spend billions and billions of dollars, which help grow our economy.
Mark, how do you tell the audience a little bit how you do your projections on this, looking at past history and what had happened, and how you think about those projections going forward about specifically, let's say, if we talk about undocumented immigrants here in Massachusetts, paint a picture of how likely is it that people would leave, I guess, based on these new policies.
Sure. Well, the new policies themselves really focus on creating an unfriendly environment for immigrants within the U.S., in particular Massachusetts, because of our large dependency on immigrant population for growth and also labor supply. And also as entrepreneurs, it's extremely vulnerable for Massachusetts. Now, what this means for us specifically, Jim, I think in where the calculations came from is really looking at how much we could see a decline in population, not only undocumented immigrants, where we project a 3 or 5% annualized decline, but also undocumented, where we could see a 10 to 15% decline if ICE deportations are as aggressive as the president has suggested. So when you add these two together, you're really getting a perfect storm, because it's not only a decline in our documented legal immigrants, but also our undocumented. And the spillover risk, of course, is our foreign students who now actually look elsewhere because of this less friendly environment in which to study.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. I mean, later on, we'll talk a little bit about foreign students too, but just on that point, Mark and Josh, I mean, in your own world, you are both at universities. What do you see in terms of sort of atmosphere among students, immigrant students, I should say foreign students? What do you see? What do you hear? And this is just it's a non-research question. It's an observational question.
Yeah, Josh, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think they feel good. You know, I've gotten some specific questions. You know, can they deport me? Can they take away my visa? And you know, I tell them I don't think they will, right? But they have done it to some people, right? Now the total, you know, yeah, and so they have done it to some students, right? And so I don't think they feel good. I think they notice it. And to Mark's point, I think there's this feeling that maybe they're not less welcome, right? And we're in the very early days of the administration. It's to be seen next academic calendar, right? What these effects are going to be, how dissuaded people are going to be. I've sent out a few emails to some prospective international students who have applied to UWS, and I don't get many responses, and I'm not surprised, because if I'm an international student and I'm looking at what's happening right now, I'm worried, right? And so, yeah, I do think we need to worry about the message that we're sending. I mean, we just detained in February this student at Harvard who is researching cancer and who is making, you know, actual steps towards solving the problem of cancer. And she's Russian, right? If we deport her, we're sending a very talented cancer researcher to Russia, of all places, right? So we need to think about the message we're sending and what we're actually losing when these students become fearful of coming over here.
Mark, on your end?
Yeah, at Boston University in particular, I just speak anecdotally to stories that I've heard through students and concerns. It's not only the fear of deportation. My TA in particular she's Greek, she's a graduate student. She was even concerned about going back for the holidays, questioning whether she could even come back again. So these sort of things raise the risk and the uncertainty, and they make graduate students of the future to say, maybe there's other places like in London or Australia or Canada that I can go, and there's other graduate programs outside Massachusetts. Again, this has been our competitive edge. The top, as a percentage of foreign students, the university in Massachusetts, of course, is Northeastern. BU has the second largest student population of foreign students. So that's, again, these are the spillover risks that we actually are dealing with now as a result of some of these immigration policies.
Well, this is not a dissimilar, it's a sort of related question, but we've seen something in the data around cancellations of folks visiting the United States on the tourism side. So I guess I'd be, later on, when we talk about foreign students in a little more depth, I'd love to hear if you are seeing anything in the data in terms of people declining to come. That would be a really bad thing for Massachusetts, obviously. But let me ask about tourism. You were talking about spending within the state by immigrants and the impact of having them leave the state. We're talking about the impact on the state's tax coffers. Talk to me about the tourism industry, Mark. Give us a sense of the size of it. Give us a sense of what you see as the potential impact of policies that have been put into place over the last 100 days on tourism in Massachusetts.
Well, in Massachusetts, the tourism season is pretty narrow because of our wonderful weather. But we have over 51 million tourists that come. Now, of those, about 2.1 million are international tourists. But when you add that all together, it's over $20 billion a year, but it supports many other startup businesses that help sort of ripple through the economy. So even a 10, 20, or 30% reduction in foreign, in which my projections are we're going to lose maybe 20 to 30% foreign visitors, that has significant economic implications for Massachusetts, not only in lost fees in Logan. Logan itself is a big cash cow for the Boston area,
Yep.
but more broadly for Massachusetts. And this is not just, these are foreign visitors coming from Canada who maybe will go elsewhere. And I think Josh alluded to that earlier. So again, when we add all of this up, you realize that these policies have implications that are much broader than just, maritime trade, much broader than immigration, much broader than just NIH funding cuts, but also means something pretty significant when you add them up from an economic perspective.
Yeah, understood. Not to speak of also the labor issues on the Cape, right, where finding people actually going to be working when the tourists are coming and to have a huge impact there and elsewhere. Let's go back to foreign students for a second. Love to hear, Josh, if you could talk to us a little bit about that pipeline of talent coming to the United States as foreign students and what it means for the innovation brand that the United States has, and especially for us, the innovation brand that Massachusetts has.
Absolutely. Like you said, the U.S. is known as an entrepreneurial hub, and within the U.S., Massachusetts is particularly known as an entrepreneurial hub, although we have other ones now like Silicon Valley, and immigrants are a big driver behind that, especially your STEM graduates. There's a lot of good research. There's a researcher named Jennifer Hunt who does really good research on the likelihood of an immigrant patenting. And we find that immigrants are much more likely to patent compared to their native counterparts, which means they're much more likely to invent things. And these are utility patents too. These aren't kind of patents like anti-competitive patents, if you will. And so they're more likely to patent. And that difference is almost entirely explained by the fact that they're more likely to be STEM graduates. So they're more likely to major in the science, engineering, technology fields where innovation is particularly likely. And we have other good research that shows it uses a natural experiment. I love natural experiments as a researcher, and it's kind of a morbid one, if you will. They look at immigrant and native co-founders who have an ongoing patent that they're working on, and they find instances where the immigrant co-founder died unexpectedly. And they find that when the immigrant co-founder dies unexpectedly, the patent is much less likely to be published. But the same is not true for when the native dies unexpectedly. And they have a few theories behind that, right? But all that to say, immigrants are extremely important for this pipeline of knowledge and talent and innovation. And they're particularly important at the college level. And in fact, some of these STEM programs in the US are no longer solvent without immigrants, right? Not only do they make up a majority of the students in these programs, they also pay out-of-state tuition. They also pay more tuition than natives do. So we're going to have to also close down some programs if we get rid of too many international students.
Mark, could you give us a little more on the picture in Massachusetts among the universities, and maybe a little focus on which universities are most exposed financially because, let's say, a larger percentage of their students are foreign students. So if we see an outflow of foreign students, or we see less interest in coming to the United States and in particular to Massachusetts, which universities are most at risk? And can you kind of paint a picture around that? What kind of risk are we talking about?
Sure. And the risk itself is foreign student exit risk. And that is that this crop of students that we were expecting each year, it was an annuity, no longer arrive. And where we'll see that hit, we'll starting in the class of 2027. The class of 2026, that group have already come in. We're looking at possibly 10 to 15% reductions in foreign student enrollment. Now, the universities that are at the top of the list, of course, Northeastern, Boston University, Harvard's on the top 10 list as well as Babson and Bentley. When we add these 10 universities up, just the financial hit that they would see from a reduction in foreign students could be anywhere between 300 to 450 or so $1 million per year. So that really adds up, Jim, in particular. One point about foreign students, the benefit of foreign students as well, from a university perspective, is they're full paying tuition students. That means they're the equivalent of almost 2 domestic students. So to make up that whole of a loss of a foreign student is pretty significant. Many universities like Northeastern have made it a strategy to actually seek and find this really strong international talent. So now that's a strategy change that will have to happen for these very large universities going forward if these policies stay in place.
And I'd like to move, if we could, is there anything else you want to talk about on foreign students? Because otherwise I might like to move this point to next steps and also questions from the audience, if that's okay. But just, is there any other points you guys want to make on the foreign student side?
Well, one point I'd like to add is, of course, foreign students that are in their 20s will be in their 30s if they stay in the U.S., in particular Massachusetts, will be the future entrepreneurs. They'll start startups that actually can create more jobs and opportunities. So it's actually a jobs manufacturing facility that we're losing with these foreign students not staying and retaining them in Massachusetts. And I would think from an economic development standpoint, that'd be a big concern in Massachusetts.
Yep, agreed. Well, let me open to the first question we have from the audience, which goes back to the question of legal versus undocumented workers. And the question is, the flood of illegal immigrants during the Biden administration led to upwards of $2 billion in state and local expenditures for housing, food, medical care, and other services. Urban school, already underperforming, must devote additional resources to English as a second language programs. Stopping illegal immigration is probably a net positive for state and local budgets. That's the elephant in the room. Great question. I guess I want to put it to you guys. You could turn this into in two ways. One is, do we really have, is the presence of, in this case, I guess 400,000, 200 to 400,000 undocumented workers, isn't that a problem as well? And how do we kind of figure out the trade-offs there? The second one is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Could you have more legal immigrants and have less undocumented immigrants? And that's a conversation we probably should get into a little bit later. But let me just throw it out there and get your comments.
Sure. In regard to Massachusetts in particular, because I've looked into these numbers,
Yep.
roughly 30% of shelter, those that are taking advantage of the shelter opportunities in Massachusetts are undocumented immigrants.
Yep.
So what we can assume then is that $300 million plus per year are actually used for undocumented immigrants. When you add the contribution that undocumented immigrants provide in regard to spending power, taxes paid specifically for the economy, versus the cost, and the cost is not only shelter cost, but also the cost of schooling. In Massachusetts, per student, we have some of the highest costs in the nation. When you add those pluses and those minuses together, you still get a positive. And that should not be surprising. Academic studies, many empirical studies have been done that have demonstrated that net immigrants, undocumented, provide more benefits than cost. One last point, undocumented immigrants, when they do pay into the tax system, they're also paying Social Security and Medicare benefits that they're not receiving back. So as a result, that is another net benefit in that whole process.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah,
Josh, how about you?
Sorry, yeah, I'll follow up on that. So I absolutely agree with Sarah that lowering the number of unauthorized illegal immigrants in the U.S. is a net positive. the quickest way to do that is by allowing legal immigration. I agree it's bad to have tons of illegal immigrants. It's bad when a large portion of your population is denied access, legal access to the labor market. It becomes difficult for them to contribute to the economy. It becomes difficult for them to find a well-paying job. And beyond that, even the immigrants who are legal, who we do allow in, we completely strip them of their labor market freedom. Refugees, for example, often have to wait 180 days before being allowed to work. That's a long time. I've never been involuntarily unemployed for 180 days since I've started working in my professional life. That would absolutely devastate me. And it would be incredibly difficult for me to contribute to the economy. H-1B holders are not allowed to start a business. They're barely allowed to switch employers. If they switch employers, they have to go through the whole process again, and it's not guaranteed that they'll be able to stay. And so I completely agree. Unauthorized immigration is a huge problem. I like to compare it to alcohol prohibition during the 1920s. Alcohol prohibition was a big problem during the 1920s. It led to crime, it led to violence, and it led to costs. The solution to that problem was not to go after people who are partaking in alcohol even harder. The solution was to create a legal framework in which we could regulate that alcohol. We can use those alcohol sales to get tax dollars. And so I agree that it's a problem, but it's an entirely manufactured problem because we make it almost impossible to immigrate legally.
Yeah, I think the point that should be raised here in Massachusetts is of undocumented immigrants, many of them have been here for 10 years or more within our economy. So to just strip them away from our economy has economic implications. My study is just focused on the economic implications, not the social and political implications of these things. So I think that's very important to think that, we are so dependent, Massachusetts, on immigrants. And we have been increasingly dependent on undocumented immigrants. So that is something that we need to solve. I would agree with Josh. We should have a pathway for legitimate immigration, and we should actually close the doors for undocumented immigrants because that actually harms the overall system. But we haven't seen policy that either solves that problem. And I would argue that the policy today, the Trump policy, isn't solving a problem, it's creating an economic harm, which has significant implications to large places like Massachusetts, other states like California and New York.
Let me move to a second question we just received. This is, is there any research on the entrepreneurship and innovation by second generation immigrants? And Josh, you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, I'm trying to figure out a way if I can drop the link in the chat.
Just send it to John Guerra, and I think he can upload it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I actually have a little bit of research. One of my earlier papers looked at this, and we kind of developed this theory of entrepreneurial assimilation. So the idea is that your first generation immigrants are the ones that decide to take on that risk. So they're going to be your risk lovers, if you will. And according to, the theory of, risk loving and being an entrepreneur and how those two relate, it makes sense that those would be the ones most likely to be an entrepreneur and not your second gen immigrants. But still, to Mark's point, there's also this idea that culture has to do with entrepreneurship. If we're part of a certain culture and we move into a different culture, or if we have 1 foot in a different culture, then we recombine ideas and think of new things that others would not have thought about. And so we find that second generation immigrants are more entrepreneurial than natives, less entrepreneurial than their first generation counterparts. We actually call that entrepreneurial assimilation. And we typically find that kind of assimilation among second gen immigrants. They become more like natives, less like immigrants, and it happens in 1 generation. A very fun example of that relates to crime. First generation immigrants are actually a lot less likely to commit crime than natives. As soon as the second generation hits, they assimilate into higher crime rates, which is kind of funny, right? So I often tell people assimilation's not always good.
There's a third question here I want to share with you guys. It's how do immigrants pay, or undocumented immigrants pay income tax without a social security number? Any
Mark, do you
thoughts?
want to take that?
Yeah, so they are able to get a TIN number, so without a social security number, and an employer requests and requires that to start the payment process.
And actually, if you go to the, oh, sorry, Mark.
No, it's not that hard to get that set up for new immigrant workers.
And if you go to the tax authority website, they actually tell you we expect you to pay taxes on any income earned, even if it's illegal. And I mentioned alcohol prohibition. Funny enough, Al Capone did not go to jail for racketeering. He went to jail for evading taxes. And so the tax authorities do indeed expect you to pay taxes on illegally earned income. And that's not just for unauthorized immigrants, it's also for drug dealers, prostitutes, any of those people, right?
All of whom line up to make those payments, I'm sure. Listen, let's talk a little bit about mitigation strategies for Massachusetts. What do you see that the state can do? Let's assume the policies in place remain as they are. Okay. What are mitigation strategies for Massachusetts to counter the losses that you described, Mark?
Sure, and I just wanted to articulate how much the financial hit will be to Massachusetts. I'm estimating for next year that the tax revenue will decline by $1 billion. GDP will decline by at least $12.8 billion. And over the Trump administration through 2028, we're looking at these numbers doubling, in particular, if we move into recession or even a larger global recession. So this is really very significant. This is an economic attack on Massachusetts. So Massachusetts needs to view it that way. And there should be a war room set up. Massachusetts should actually create a delegation. I was happy to see the governor announce yesterday that she's putting a trade delegation together to talk to our largest trade partners, which is Canada and China and Mexico in particular. Massachusetts has to view itself as a standalone, almost a standalone country where it has to actually say what policies are best for us. There needs to be more of a group view within the Attorney General's office that any litigation should be actually done in cooperation with other very large states that also are disproportionately hit by Trump's immigration policies. So I think there's a lot of collective things that Massachusetts can do. In particular, I think the first step in actually solving a problem is identifying it. And I think the study has done a great job of defining the risk. And now the question is, okay, we know what it is. How best can we manage it and try to mitigate? One thing in particular the House has done on the Senate side, it's actually put additional funds aside for the Attorney General's office to allow them to litigate. And the more litigation and the further you can delay the implications of many of these policies, the better economically off Massachusetts is going to be. And I'll give a quick example. And Josh, I want you to jump in here. NIH funding itself was cut and the announcement was made in February. But yet in March, there's a stay at the federal level, court level in Massachusetts, which has allowed these funds to continue to flow, which are extremely important for innovation and growth within the Massachusetts economy. Just by delaying that cut of NIH funds will have implications of the millions of dollars, and if it's delayed for the next year, billions of dollars. So I think these are all really positive steps.
Josh, I might, if it's okay, because we're getting close to the end, I want to turn and spend time on what I think is, for my money, just as important as the current policy making around immigration and immigrant entrepreneurship. I guess I want to go back to some of the work that you have done on the crazy quilt of visas and how it forecloses the country from having access to super highly talented people. You talked about other countries poaching and all that sort of stuff. Can you give us sort of like, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make sure that we have plentiful, if you will, ammunition to innovate and grow on the basis of great talent present here in Massachusetts and elsewhere?
Absolutely. I would actually, I think there's a lot of synergy to be had between kind of ideological preferences that have been expressed by the Trump administration and what I would recommend. I would basically recommend regulatory slashing of our current immigration system. It's way too complicated. There's way too much red tape, way too many regulatory barriers. I would create kind of maybe a Doge for immigration policy, right? We need to cut waste. We need to cut the unnecessary red tape that's in our immigration system. We don't need 180 pathways. We need 3 or 4, right? We have family reunification visas, labor market visas, and maybe some humanitarian visas as well, right? And that's all we need to do. So we need to increase the amount of people who are legally allowed to come. That's the first thing we need to do. And even before we do that, even if we find it difficult to agree on the number of immigrants who we allow in, I think we can all agree that the ones we do allow in, we should not restrict their labor market mobility. We should not make it more difficult for them to contribute to our society or to assimilate. And so for the ones that do come here, we need to actually grant them labor market freedom. We need to let them work, let them contribute, let them be taxpayers, let them open up businesses. Honestly, we need to get out of the way. Immigrants, I like to say, immigrants can make us rich if we let them, right? So we need to let them. And we don't have to pay them money. We don't have to give them housing. They can afford that. Most of them can afford that themselves if we allow them the autonomy and the dignity of being able to work.
That's great. I hate to say it, but I'd like to end on that. I think that is a great statement of and a great vision for the future in terms of what we can do here. And I just want to stop here for a second. I know that Andrew's going to close us out, and I'm going to invite him back in here. But I just want to say to both of you, I really, really appreciate the data-driven, fact-driven, let's have a conversation, let's disagree, let's go back and forth, let's find places where we have absolute commonality in trying to figure out how we move forward, because it's really important to Massachusetts, really important to our universities, it's really important to our future as a great, competitive, prosperous state. So I'm really grateful for the work that you guys do. And Andrew, tossing it back to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Josh. That really was a fantastic conversation today. And I know I walked away learning a lot. To all of our attendees today, we'll be sure to share this recording with you afterwards. We hope that you'll share it out with your network and other folks that you know so that we can continue this conversation at a broader level. Before we wrap for today officially, I did want to take a moment just to share some upcoming events that we have coming on here at Pioneer over the next few weeks. So we'll go ahead and pull this up. And what I'd like to do is just to highlight a couple of brief events that I want to make sure that you are aware of. So tomorrow we have an in-person event coming up in Auburn, Massachusetts, featuring Stephen Wilson, Pioneer's Senior Education Fellow. He'll be talking about his latest book, The Lost Decade, Returning to the Fight for Better Schools in America. For those of you interested in our healthcare accessibility, on May 20th, our life sciences team will be hosting a hybrid event down in DC and also on Zoom, where participants will be briefed on our new web tool, which tracks how the Inflation Reduction Act's pharmaceutical price controls are impacting patient access to care. On Thursday, May 29th, we'll have the Pioneer Public Interest Law Center hosting a hybrid event here in Boston that will examine the Steward healthcare system's failure and collapse, and some great insights from some people that really led the proceedings on the bankruptcy process there. Next, on Thursday, June 5th, we will host a Zoom featuring Andrew McCullough, our housing lead, that will be looking at how we can streamline some housing permitting and the process here in Massachusetts. And finally, for any of the golfers out there, on Tuesday, June 17th, we'll be hosting our 3rd annual Pioneer Fishers Island golf outing. And we only have a few spots left. So if you are interested, please be sure to reach out today. So again, thank you to Jim, Mark, Josh for a fantastic conversation. And thank you to all of our participants today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great day.